Now we're recording. And so it was nice to come back to this book. I used to teach this like every other year in my previous school, and I haven't done it at all since I've been at Colgate, because they only have me doing American politics, which I enjoy, but political philosophy is just special. So, and it's great that he's teaching it in a foundational class. Moral vision is kind of a freshman, sophomore level class. And it's one of those books that's sort of foundational for everything else you study. You'll think back to it a lot, even if you're studying American politics or foreign affairs or something. It's just, he touches on so many deep and fundamental things about politics and the human soul, right? I mean, where else do you talk about the soul? Political science. Plato has the edge on that. But yeah, just a review last time. What is he getting at in book 7? 7 kind of goes with 6, but both of them are addressing the education of the philosopher, right? Which in the perfect city is the king, right? And he had so much to say in the previous books about the education of the soldiers, the auxiliaries, or the guardians, different names, right? But so much of what their training is to make them totally devoted to the city, but also to make them responsive to the philosopher kings, right? Because there's that description, they're like sheepdogs, right? How do you keep them from eating the sheep? They're strong and powerful, right? You got to train them. So too, I mean, how do you get these soldiers to listen to the voice of reason clearly? Well, you have to be trained and trained and trained. So the philosopher king just, whispers things and they execute, right? Just like that. All of that being, of course, a model of the soul. Because again, I drew it on the board last time, right? What are we trying to see here? We're trying to find a way of understanding the human soul. And it's hard to see, isn't it? It's just sort of hidden and obscured, not just other people's souls, but your own, right? Your mystery to yourselves. So yeah, the city in speech is a way to help us see that. And so even as he's describing kind of this abstract city of speech doesn't actually exist, he's still saying things that are true about human beings, right, here in the real world. And so you can sort of pull things out of it that apply to real people. So yeah, what is the education of a philosopher like? There's that wonderful parable at the beginning, one of those famous images from this book, the cave. What does the cave teach us? Yeah.
Where you go out of the cave and you see where, and you go back into the cave where the shadows of reality.
Yeah.
And you teach, or you try to bring other people and educate, and you have to sacrifice yourself back into the shadows in order for like the greater.
Yeah. That's the amazing twist, isn't it? You got to go back. And the student says, "Why? I'm out here on the sunshine." No, you got to go back because you need to reach out to other potential philosophers who then will go back. And the hope is too that who will take charge of the shadows? Those people, that they will still cast opinions on the wall. They'll be puppet masters, but they'll be ones who cast opinions according to what they know from outside, instead of just for manipulation, right? Yeah, sorry.
And it also teaches us not to, that everyone can't be a student, because it can also go wrong.
Yeah.
And they become the puppet masters,
Yeah.
politicians.
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to say that. He's really big on how education needs to be carefully approached. You can't just educate everybody. So, I mean, what's different with modern times in the Enlightenment era? Everybody can be educated, right? Get everybody out of the cave. Or I think the later Enlightenment is, let's dynamite the cave. And, or Plato, no, the cave isn't going away. And most people are going to need their shadows, and that's all right. Right? You can't expect grandma to be a philosopher. It's not going to happen. So maybe some grandmas, but for the most part, the traditions of the city and the customs. By the way, the word nomos or nomoi is plural. That's the word for law. It's also the word for custom. They mean practically the same thing for Greek. Anybody know what else nomos means? Song. So it's this word that means several different things in Greek. How is a law like a song? Do we sing our laws? Do we sing the Constitution? Article 1. No, it's not. No, laws are customs and traditions, like patterns. So in a way, they're kind of like laws. They have that structure and order to them. And so it was true. A lot of Greek cities, their songs were singable. Spartans especially, right? They would sing their laws, sort of patriotic. But yeah, people need those. Right. It's a very important point. You can't just liberate everybody. Otherwise, you can corrupt them. Not everyone should learn to call things into question. Let's be clear, though, a few things. Like, what is the cave not about? There's a strong American temptation to think we see it a certain way. personal liberation, right? The cave is the system, and I'm the free thinking individual. And I've got, isn't that every Disney movie in the last 30 years? Isn't that just such a common theme? Not a bad storyline, but still, it's kind of redundant, isn't it? I sat through Moana recently. The individual who knows better than everybody else, and so they're going to liberate themselves, and that's not what Plato means. It is a very individual experience, that's true, but it doesn't mean that the cave is bad. He can acknowledge that the cave might be good and necessary. It's a question of what kind of opinions and impressions do people get, and who's going to take charge of it. So yeah, we didn't get all the way through 7, but what does he have to say? What did we leave off? Well, yeah, what are the elements of the education of this philosopher? What does he say? First of all, who should learn philosophy? He has a very shocking age bracket. How old should you be to study philosophy? What's his level of maturity? Did you catch it? I'm breaking Plato's rule right here, but then so is Socrates.
Yeah, to be older, right?
Yeah, mature, still young, but more mature. 537D says it. No one under 30. And yet, how old are Glaucon and Edemantus and the other guys? They're only teenagers. So here's Socrates basically philosophizing. It's like Groucho Marx, right? I never want to be a member of a club where people like myself are members, right? Socrates is really breaking his own rule here, isn't he? So yeah, what else? He lists several things, but what are the elements of a philosophic education? And again, these philosopher kings are drawn from the ranks of the military. So they've been trained, but now they start to turn to these exercises of the mind that are a lot more strenuous. 4 in particular, what are they? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
He was mentioning like intellection, thought, trust, and imagination.
Yeah, kind of like these levels, right? Trust, the Greek word is pistes. It also can be translated as faith. That's word used throughout the New Testament, in fact, in the Bible. But yeah, trust is like when you have reason to believe that the impressions you're given have some truth to them, that your opinions are not totally false. But then there's intellection. What is that? That's when you go from, remember, doxa or opinion to eidos, idea, reality. And how do you do that exactly? Plato thought the path was actually quite clear. You perceive it with your mind. So I can do a geometric proof on the board. I won't, but and you could stare at it. You ever done this in geometry? You stare and stare and stare at that proof. And all of a sudden you see it. What do you see? Your eyes saw the lines on the board all the while, right? But then your mind sees it. You get it, right? The two angles are equal to each other. And you can do all kinds of axioms and proofs that way. But when you do a geometric proof, you see with your mind. That's intellection, right? And there's a degree of certainty to that. So yeah, geometry is one of those things. Yeah, what are the 4 things he lists between 521C and 532A? It's several pages, but yeah.
Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music.
Yeah, that's right. Think about how these things fit together. This is a critical part of classic liberal arts. Liberal arts usually would start with what's called the trivium, and that was grammar, rhetoric, and logic. That's how to make sense. That's how to write clearly. But then you move upward and you study arithmetic as well as geometry. Well, these have kind of a practical application. So you study them in the abstract, right? But what is the practical application of arithmetic? And you said in those 4, what does arithmetic align with?
Or no, music.
Music, right? Yeah, music. Is math like music? Musicians? Anything out there? No musicians?
You count.
You count, yeah. You divide up each measure and according to a certain number of beats. Intervals between notes is what makes melodies and harmonies. Yeah, it's very mathematical. I can't believe it. No musicians. Sailor, you musician? Or sorry, musician.
I used to be, but I wasn't very good. Maybe because I'm not very good at
Yeah, it's funny how there's such a correlation between it. Of course, in high school, I don't remember learning this. They seemed very opposite of each other. But as you grow in your studies of music, you realize it's very mathematical. It's very about proportions and measures and everything. Geometry aligns with something kind of surprising, though. Yeah, astronomy, right? And that word comes from Greek. The astro is the star, aster. Here's a little side note. What's a disaster? A disaster. It's when the stars are crossed and bad things happen, right? Romeo and Juliet were a disaster because they were, what does the play say? Star-crossed lovers, right? They had bad astronomy. Nomoi, I said it a minute ago, that's the word for law. It can also mean song. It's the law of the stars. Now, that's different from the words of the stars. What do you think the words of the stars were in Greek? What's the word for word? Logos, astrologos, consulting your horoscope, right? The belief that the stars speak and dictate things. No, the stars don't speak, the stars sing, nomoi. And they sing according to predictable laws because the planets always go in the same motions, right? Or relatively the same. The stars are always there. And so the ancient cosmos, they didn't understand, stars as like these remote bodies or anything. They were marks in the sky. And there were like the spheres, and the planets rotated on the big spheres. Geometry, though, has that same certainty to it as astronomy has. And so you kind of understand geometry. So this is basically math applied in time. This is math applied in space, right? So there you go. What do you call all these for? This was known as the trivium. For Plato, these are the things that initiate the philosopher into philosophy. And what role does each one play? He had so much to say about music earlier, didn't he? The music of the Guardian class is immensely important. But that was more about the music they hear, right? This has more to do with the music that gets produced. It needs to be proportionate and beautiful in the way that it captures that proportion. So to geometry, that habit of seeing with the mind when you grasp a geometric proof. Astronomy, seeing like the fixed and permanent aspects of the cosmos. There you go. But above all, what's the method of studying this? We talked about it last time. Speeches and lectures and essays. And what does he say? 532, 532A. Dialectic, remember conversation? And it's a question and answer. And even if you do give a good speech, the best speeches, if you study them, are themselves kind of dialectic, aren't they? Like what does Abraham Lincoln do in the Cooper Union speech? You say this. And he lays out his opponent's argument. But I reply that. So it's really kind of a conversation. Or even Jesus Christ, right? You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, if you that's it. It's sort of like that back and forth kind of conversation. But yeah, what sorts of things do they learn through the process of this conversation? I'm skipping around here, but what happens in the course of mathematics? You grow up hearing music, but then when you study music, you find out how mathematical it is. You grow up looking at the stars, but then when you study astronomy and you find out how akin it is to geometry, that's where the divided line happens, right? That's inside the cave. This is outside the cave. They relate, but they're distinct in a really important way. He gives the example of like holding up fingers, right? Like, what's that? Those are my fingers. No, what does it really mean? Something that has nothing to do with my hand. That's his example, right? Where's 3? Do I say it's right here? No, this symbolizes the abstract idea of 3. You see it in your head, right? Or Peter Kreef's famous example, if you point, your dog is looking for its food bowl and you say, it's right there, what will the dog do? It'll sniff your hand. I saw my 2-year-old figure this out just recently. She wants something. It's right there. It's right there. She's screaming and going crazy. Like, no, it's right there. She just figured out what the pointer finger means. No, I'm indicating it's over there. And so she'll look. And so it's funny to watch kids learn this. Plato was a keen observer of children and how they learn. So what happens when you go from one thing to another? In the very way we were just now saying, he says, top of page 205, 525D, it leads the soul powerfully upward, out of that cave, right? And compels it to discuss numbers themselves. You know, you can use marbles or rocks or whatever. Remember in elementary school using those little beans, bean count, right? You start to gain a sense of abstraction. You do this with letters too, don't you? I mean, what is a book really? It's just a bunch of markings on paper. And yet, when you learn to read, you find that there are ideas that you abstract out of those words. It won't at all permit anyone to propose for discussion numbers that are attached to visible or tangible bodies. No, it's about ideas. It's seeing with the mind. So that's what happens in the process of studying geometry and arithmetic. You learn to see what's really behind music, what's really behind astronomy. And it's incredible to think for centuries. I mean, this was like standard liberal education. You still see traces of it today in college education, right? You got to take some natural science. You do, math, usually 1 or 2 classes, more often for entry, admission. You don't necessarily have to take music. You should take some kind of fine art and learn proportion and things like that. But it lasted quite some time. How does he describe then liberal education through dialectic? It's a beautiful passage, page 211. Yeah, someone read that bottom paragraph. Sums it all up here. Go ahead.
Then I said, the release from the bonds and the turning around from the shadows to the phantoms and the light, the way up from the cave to the sun. And once there, the persisting inability to look at the animals and the plants and the sun's light, and looking instead at the divine appearances and water and at shadows of the things that are, rather than as before, at shadows of phantoms cast by a light that, when judged in comparison with the sun, also has the quality a shadow of a phantom.
Yeah.
Of a shadow of a phantom. All this activity of the arts which we went through has the power to release and leads what is best in the soul up to the contemplation of what is best in the things that are.
Yeah, long sentence. So good job though. But yeah, I mean, what a great description. It's that upward leading, that process of liberal education. It's hard, but the rewards are just profound. Isn't that what education ought to be, at least in the highest sense? What is the end of dialectic? He says in the next page, truth itself, right? In a way that no speech or essay could ever perfectly capture. The effect of dialectic is quite different from all other arts. It's about knowledge and thought rather than, back to your point, compared to trust or imagination. Knowledge and thought are much more real than anything else. So who is to study dialectic? Though? He comes back to that point again and again. You got to discern very carefully. It's not for everybody. And it's a remarkable thing that we assume that it is today, especially in American universities. Oh, everybody should have this release and this liberation. Plato says, no, not everybody. Why do we think everybody should, though? What makes us think this is such a good idea? This is so safe. Or are we just causing mass corruption across the American youth? What leads to this concept that everyone should be freed from the cave? Plato presents a real challenge to us, doesn't he? Yeah.
Well, in the section we just read, he talked about how democracy is like we think of it as a form of equality. And so everyone deserves the right for education.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, we'll get to democracy in the next book. But isn't that the assumption of democracy, right? That everyone should have totally equal access. And otherwise you're talking hierarchy. You're saying those with liberal education are better than everybody else. We don't like that. We like equality. It shows how democratic we are in the United States. Despite all our institutions and everything, we have very democratic impulses and ideas. Plato says that that's a mistake. I mean, only the few should receive this liberal education. And he says that very specifically, 353a, 214. Well then, the distribution is still ahead of you. To whom shall we give these studies and how far shall we do it? That's plainly the next question. Do you remember in the former selection of the rulers what sort of men were selected? How could I not remember? Says Glaucon. Well then, so far as most of the requirements go, suppose that those who are the natures that must be chosen, the steadiest and most courageous must be preferred, and insofar as possible, the best looking. For some reason, he includes best looking, but still, the steadiest and courageous makes sense. What sorts of things must you see in them? when should you offer this liberal education? He lists a bunch of study habits and qualities of character, especially. Keenness at studies, a willingness to read and work hard. Describes all of you, doesn't it? Right? A capacity for hard work, which they would have learned among the ranks of the auxiliaries in the military, right? Now they basically take their military skill and apply it to their studies. It's interesting having had vets in my class before, not this year, but they have a certain work ethic with their studies that really stands out compared to undergraduates. They've been in the service, and so they work pretty hard. It's pretty impressive. In contrast, you get the wrong recipients of philosophy. And what do? They dishonor it. They misuse it. They use it to justify their vices and to rationalize and say all kinds of fashionable things that make them sound really smart, like justice is the will of the stronger, Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a product of this bad philosophic education, right? So yeah, only the right ones must be educated. What is the best education for the young? Prepare them for later receiving a philosophic education, right? But don't show it to them too soon. Because again, if they start philosophizing too early, it'll corrupt them. So like we said, no philosophy before 30. Yeah, what else does he say? I'm kind of skipping around here, but isn't it the wrong selection of students that leads to philosophy getting such a bad reputation? And he really hammers that point. He says, this is why everyone thinks philosophy is so worthless or it's so evil. It's because students get taught badly. It's because the teachers don't discriminate. And who was especially guilty of that? The sophists. They would teach anybody whose parents paid the tuition, right? And they would not discern whether or not the students they were teaching this stuff were skilled. True, most of what sophists taught was public speaking, like we said, you probably saw. But with that came a certain philosophy that everything is power and manipulation, and that's all it is. So what do you do to avoid this? It's above convention, those who are liberated from the floor of the cave, but they don't necessarily leave the cave. They're not truly taught. They're not really enlightened, and they become corrupted, he says, 539a, by whoever flatters the most. Oh, you're so smart. I love the speech you gave. And if you throw that at a young 20-something guy, who does speak eloquently, how can he resist the flattery? He can't. This is what leads to philosophy's bad reputation. So, and by the way, who else receives this education? Kind of ties together what he said before. Not just men, but women too. What does he say about them? Their minds, physically might be different, maybe emotionally different, but their minds, their capacity to reason, the noblest thing in them is just like men. These things mean the very same thing in a woman's mind as it does in a man's mind, right? So women should be taught to be philosophers too. So there you go. He concludes, all those in the city who happen to be older than 10, they'll be sent out to the country. And taking over their children, they will rear them far away from those dispositions they now have from their parents, in their own manners and laws that are such as we described before. And with the city and the regime of which we were speaking, thus established most quickly and easily, it will itself be happy and most profit the nation in which it is to come to be. That's the easiest way. So basically saying, how are we going to institute this kind of republic? How are we going to make it happen? Well, you start with the earliest ages and you start educating them early. Right? Parents, butt out. We're going to start training them early, which is, a real infringement on the way things actually are. But again, it's these extreme measures that are going to make it happen. So the perfectly just city as a model of the soul. What does this say, though, about all other cities in practice? Now we can start the delay. Here he has his regime analysis. Regimes, what does a regime mean? Is it the same thing as government? No, government is a modern invention with institutions. They can be made to preserve and perpetuate regimes, right? So what is the American regime? We are basically a democratic republic. What keeps it going, though? The Constitution, Congress, presidency, the courts, state governments, right? But no, a regime originally was just an arrangement of citizens. Who holds power and why? So that's what he turns to in book 8. And here you've got the perfectly just city. I'll draw it again. Remember, it looks like that. That's how I imagine it. He doesn't call it a pyramid, but you know, you've got the soldier class ruling over the others, and it's a model of the soul. Where does a city go wrong though? What's a corrupt city look like? Flips. Yeah, exactly. Here's a bad city. It's upside down, and you've got what happens. It's when the passions rule over reason. No, reason is supposed to rule over the passions. Remember, he said earlier, that's justice. There's an unjust soul. It's flipped. The passions now rule over reason. It's corrupt. That happens in a person. That happens in a city too, when the passions dominate. And the only thing that can maintain order is just power, the king, right? We start though with that perfectly just regime. And everybody in it knows their place. And it's a model of the soul, but there's sort of like a downward spiral. There's a cycle that happens. Now, be careful when we say this. Does he mean it happens historically? Like we all started there in some kind of golden age, and then it all fell apart across time? No, it's sort of always happening. It's a cyclical thing. Remember, Greeks didn't think historically or linear like we do. Like there's developments and steps, and this happened and that happened. They tell a story that way, sure, but their understanding of these fundamental human institutions were cyclical. They sort of went in circles. That's why Aristotle, in his naturalistic writings, he didn't have any concept of like the beginning of things, creation, the Big Bang. No, he just thought the world had always existed. How could he say that? Where did it come from, right? They've just always been here, and it went in these cycles, and that's all he could say, right? So yeah, that's how Plato means it too. But yeah, we start off with the very best kind of regime, this rule of the philosopher kings, but it never lasts. There are 4 types of city, just as there are 4 types of soul. What is the highest and best kind of city? That's the closest approximation to this. And here he actually names an actual city in Greece that most resembles this.
Cretan and Laconian.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the Cretians and the Laconians. And who are the Laconians? He has to choose his words carefully. Who are they? Those are Spartans. Laconia was another word for Sparta. What did he just do there as an Athenian? Athens had just been defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars, remember? He's talking like a traitor, right? So you can see how this could get him into some trouble. But he refers to Laconians as like the region of Sparta's in, not referring specifically to the city. In fact, if I remember right, tell me if you see it, but I don't think he ever specifically refers to Sparta, the city. He just says Laconia, the region. But yeah, they're the ones who get it right. And what does their city look like? What do they call them, first of all? Yeah, democracy, right. Democracy. Time in Greek means honor. So what's the ruling principle of the democracy? It's of course honor. And so the democracy is closest to the perfectly just city. It's the perfect city / soul. It's a model of the soul. But nothing's perfect in the world, right? Everything's kind of in a constant state of decay. But the democracy comes closest. What is it like there? How does he describe the democracy? Yeah.
It's ruled by the military, and everybody rules in order to like have the most honor.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody's sort of competitive about honor. And it's very hierarchical. And the citizens are the same as the military. The working class is basically like slaves, but they're slaves who accept their position. But of course, no slaves ever do that. But really who's in charge in a democracy? Not the citizens so much as the council that meets late at night. This is exactly what Sparta was, right? By all accounts. He's praising Sparta as like the closest approximation of the perfect city. That's right. Honor, military rule, or military power anyway. Keeping the passions in order, very restrained, very keen on maintaining their own order. Tough place to live, but he still has to admit this is the best possible place you could get. What is the bedrock of this democracy, though? What really maintains it best? No, that's right. I have to walk to my next class. I'm going to do this. he mentioned something really unusual and kind of creepy, but he mentioned it already. Yeah, on page 224. One thing that makes the timocracy maintain itself, and this is true of any aristocracy, right? Did the aristocrats marry outside the family? No way, right? If you've got the noble name and you live in the castle, you marry another noble. Meanwhile, the serfs, the peasants, who do they marry? Other peasants. You never marry across class lines. Really what that is what? In fact, the Greek word, we've heard it in English, noble breeding, noble birth, eugenics. So yeah, Bloom doesn't translate that word unless I missed it. But yeah, bottom page 223, top of 224. But yeah, eugenics. You can even call it birth control if you like, but it's not individual decisions about family planning as we think of it today. No, it's the state deciding who reproduces and who doesn't, because you've got to breed the best. Was there a eugenics movement in the United States? Oh, yes, there was. In fact, I'm talking about it in my next class. And it was usually states believing that we could get rid of all crime and all social problems, substance abuse and everything, if we just keep certain people from breeding, and that's it. Creepy stuff. Long, fascinating history. But for Plato, this is the only thing that works if you're going to maintain an aristocracy, a timocracy. As you describe it. The city so composed, bottom of 223, is hard to be moved. But since for everything that has come into being, there is decay, right? We're on this downward slope here. Not even a composition such as this will remain for a time. Eventually, what's going to happen? People are going to breed wrong. There's going to be sort of a cross to, a couple that shouldn't have produced a child. And what happens? And how do you know who you breed rightly? He points to something really interesting. Back to Romeo and Juliet. You prevent the star-crossed lovers, right? You prevent families from breeding the wrong way. You prevent the honorable ones from producing offspring with the dishonorable ones. A lot of that eugenics has to do with mathematics. As he points out, because nothing's perfect, because we mess everything up eventually, somebody gets the math wrong. And accidentally, the city lets a couple produce a child they shouldn't have. Bad genes, those get passed down, and pretty soon you have a whole bunch of people in the city who are, weak links in the chain, so to speak. All this sounds extremely brutal, but remember, he is describing, an aristocracy here. And how do you maintain such a thing? Bad mixtures, though, he says, based on bad math at 346 D and E. I'll just summarize it. But yeah, the bad numbers is what gets everything off. And pretty soon what happens? The timocracy ages over time and things start to crumble. Factions appear. And people in the timocracy who were so good at war now start to think about money, right? Honor, which is the distinguishing feature of a timocracy or an aristocracy, same thing, suddenly becomes wealth. They're good at getting wealth through conquest, but they start to think, what if we channeled all of our martial energy into getting rich? Possessions of land, houses, gold, silver, what's happening? Luxury is corrupting them. Right. So we're coming up on the other regime. Yeah, money, luxury, comfort, and ease. We could get all those same things. He's not naming it yet, but he will. Yeah.
Democracy is sounding a lot like Nazi Germany.
Yes, you're exactly right.
I don't know, would he have looked at Nazi Germany and said, okay.
Good question. Yeah, I think that's when he'd step in and say, wait, we're talking about a city of speech here, right?
Yeah.
Or at least an approximation of the city of speech. And maybe the lesson here, the funny thing about this is, right, what happened? Glaucon and Erymanthus are noble, good guys, right? They want to know what justice actually is. Normally, Socrates doesn't tell people what he actually knows. He just throws out questions, gets you thinking, and then he walks away, right? This is the only dialogue where Socrates does tell you what he thinks. And he even warns them, remember a few pages back, go back to book 2, and he warns them, he says, you're not going to like it. It might sound crazy and weird and creepy. I said, no, tell us anyway, tell us anyway. So what's just happened here? For the first time, Socrates gives full disclosure, and it's horrifying. But maybe the lesson here is what? Do we want perfection in the world? No. Maybe it's okay that things are a little bit messed up. Maybe what we should do is allow people to be individuals, to let them be a little greedy, to crave luxury a little bit. Because, you know, it doesn't explain 20th century totalitarianism. It's an attempt at perfection, right? Nazi Germany along racial lines, the antebellum South also along racial lines, Soviet Union along, you know, communist lines, but still, it's always an attempt at perfection. A perfect world is achievable, and then we end up with this. It's not a place anyone would actually choose, and Socrates knows that. But he's saying, hey, maybe don't look for perfection here in the world. And he knows how idealistic Glaucon and Enymantus are, right? They're young, just like you, and they're perfect world, it's right there, it's within our grasp. Let's found the perfect city. And by the time he's done describing it, everyone knows he wouldn't actually want it. Book 5, right, ties together with this part, doesn't it? All the social planning and no families and all that. So there you go. So you okay with the world not being perfect? What do you think? Yeah, me too. Because what's preferable to perfection? How about excellence? Right? The best you're going to get given the constraints of human nature. Isn't that the realm where real beauty and excellence is possible? That's what he's getting at. So yeah, good point though. I'm glad you brought that up. What else though? How does the democracy start to fall apart?
People get money hungry.
Yeah, that's right. They start to realize all the energy they pour into war, they could just pour into, you know, industry, or turning their war talents to conquest, stealing other people's stuff and other people's money, right? The democracy is all about the full-time soldiers, and he even mentioned something very specific to Sparta. This is when everybody's red flags would have gone up. Something that doesn't sound unusual to us, but it was for the Greeks. What was it? You probably didn't miss it, but common meals. Basically the cafeteria. What was it? So totalitarian. Think about that as you go into Frank dining hall, right? Well, because sitting down for a meal was always a family thing. Before the hearth where the ancestors lived, you know, for Greeks and Romans. Everybody eating together in the city, that was basically saying that the city is a family, right? So that actually has great symbolic significance to Greek culture at the time. All the gymnastics and everything he described in earlier books. But yeah, the corruption starts to set in as these things fall apart. Desire for money, you're right. 548a, he says it again. Just as those in the, what's the name of this regime? He hasn't said it yet. Oligarchy. Yeah, right. Oligarchy. He said it back at the beginning, but yeah, here he introduces it. This is the rule of the rich, also called a plutocracy sometimes. And they are corrupted by a desire for money. Under cover of darkness, they pay fierce honor to gold and silver. And at first they hide it, right? They're a little bit ashamed to be all money grubbing. They're supposed to be honorable aristocrats. But what happens over time? They start bringing their money and their luxury out into the open, right? And that causes class envy. They are soon more concerned about money than honor. What happens to the slave class in both of these regimes? The slaves don't respect,
No, yeah,
yeah, they don't respect the honor anymore. The slaves start to wake up and realize, wait a minute, they're just rich. And the slaves start to organize under cover of darkness and start plotting and scheming. There you go. You see where things are headed. So, yeah, so all of their warlike fierceness, you know, they still talk that on the surface, but really what's happening? They're becoming corrupted. You see this in the soul. What's happening to the soul between a democratic regime that's trying so hard to be this orderly, upright, honorable soul? What's happened to the oligarchy? I erased it, but it flips. Love of money, greed is a passion, right? And the passion of greed starts becoming dominant. What happens to reason in that scheme? Reason works double time to figure out how to get more money. Wait, is that what reason's supposed to do? No, reason's supposed to be the king. Philosopher kings, right? Now what? Reason is the tool. and like the citizens are corrupted, and down, down, down we go. He talks about generations quite a bit, right? What's the relationship between a democratic father and an oligarchic son? It's always about this respect for ancestors, right? The father says, honor to the city, right? Very Spartan. The son says, yeah, yeah, honor. Meanwhile, he stuffs gold under his bed, you know. He starts developing these tastes for luxury. What happens to the grandson? He gets used to seeing his dad's hidden gold. He starts to think it's normal. The sons become corrupted. And pretty soon they're not praising honor anymore. What are they praising? Wealth and luxury, right? It's a great time. Couldn't have asked for a better thunder. Zeus is out there throwing lightning. Anyway, so yeah, what's the oligarchic character like after several generations? Everybody kind of settles into being the rich, the rich, the rich. They get really luxurious, right? They start flaunting it. They sort of publicly equate their honor with their wealth, which is a total mistake. They're not the same. But in their minds, they don't see the difference. Anyone criticizes them for flaunting their wealth too much or being greedy, what do they say? Excuse me, I'm one of the aristocrats. I'm one of the honorable ones. No, you're not. Look at all your wealth. Well, how dare you? You know, they hide behind their titles and their honor when in fact they're just abusing it, and everything's falling apart. Wealth replaces virtue. And pretty soon it starts to become apparent, this wealthy class, especially when a war breaks out, are they as good at fighting as they used to be back in the old days? Right? He's talking about generations here, right? No. They've enjoyed their luxury a little too much. They've grown soft and easygoing, and oh, war, what a hassle. I just want to get home to my hot tub, you know. Eventually, they start to look weak not only to their enemies, but to who? The working classes, the slave classes, or the serf classes. They start to say, hey, they're weak, they're frail. What about us who've been shut out of all that wealth? And so you start to see the transition from oligarchy down, down, down to where are we headed? Yeah, democracy. And we'll see the last thing we're going to talk about next time. Democracy is just the last stop before tyranny, right? But yeah, as we make this transition to democracy, what's it like? They get bad at warfare. They become poor warriors. They weren't like they were back in the old days. They can't seem to fight battles as well as they used to, and they lose a few, right? And they become busybodies. They try to make money and make war at the same time. Like Lyndon Johnson, right? Great Society, Vietnam, all at once. How'd that go? Right? They start to show this sort of deep moral decay. They don't understand anything about honor anymore, he says on page 230. So yeah, the origin of the oligarchic man, what is it? On page 231. When his son is born and at first emulates his father and follows in his footsteps and then sees him blunder against the city, right? Luxurious old dad, what are their sons like? They're totally corrupt. As against the reef and waste his property as well as himself. He has either been a general or had held some other great ruling office, and then got entangled with the court, suffered at the hands of sycophants and flatterers, and underwent death, exile, or dishonor, and lost his whole substance, right? Fortunes end up getting lost, overspending, bad investments, or something like that. I'll just leave it up. And then it all just falls apart. So yeah, every regime just has this weak spot, doesn't it? So yeah, we're headed toward democracy. What is democracy like? And here he arrives. If this is Sparta, here he arrives at his own city, Athens. He doesn't call it out by name, but this is a very direct critique of Athens. Anyway, more intense thunder as the story thickens here. Yeah, here comes the tyranny. Let's not say the word tyranny. I don't know what the thunder will do. So democracy then. What is the origin of democracy? How does democracy finally come to power? Class envy. The multitude is poor, the few are rich. And yeah, they still like to talk a tough game when it comes to their aristocratic names and their honorable titles, but no, They're frauds. They're just rich. So what did the Democrats say? Not the Democratic Party, but the worst thing they see is what? There are good men still out there, but they're poor. They're kind of the common multitude, right? They go off and fight the wars and they work hard and they die poor. That's got to be infuriating, right? The sense of injustice in that is just devastating. So we enter upon an era of revolutions and uprisings. So there you go. The first revolution takes place here. Notice this wasn't really a revolution, right? The transition from democracy to oligarchy was a gradual transition that was hardly noticeable. This, though, there's a real revolution there. The multitudes rise up. The young oligarchs find themselves living too luxuriously to care about resisting, and so care about their own virtue and the common good. And so they are overthrown by the masses. We enter a democratic revolution. What is a democracy like, though? Once they succeed, once they overthrow the oligarchs? Or what, sorry? Yeah, they're very free-spirited. There's a wonderful description. And diverse. And they love their diversity. And they hire chief diversity officers at their institution, right? It's very much a part of who we are. Democracy and diversity are very deeply connected, as it was in ancient Greece. Yeah, we like variety and beauty. Democracy is very colorful and, you know, interesting. Do whatever you like, and everybody do your own thing, and nobody judge anybody else, right? Isn't that us? Yeah. What else does he say? Does it describe Americans just perfectly? It's just exactly who we are. The only difference is we didn't evolve out of an oligarchy so much. We started as a republic, a whole different kind of regime, and sort of became more democratic.
You can make the argument that Britain was a little bit.
Yeah, that's true.
Had some of those characteristics, and that's the reason that we did.
Yeah, you can put it that way. Yeah, the red coats and the honorable, you know, the king and all that. Our current oligarchy hangs on, but it's different because it came out of democracy, the other way around, right? So the wealthiest Americans, that 1%, right? They developed because of the free market system, which Plato had no concept of. So here we are into democracy. And class ends 12:10, right? Okay. Just getting on a roll. Well, great class, guys. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this a lot. I missed this book. I will let your professor know where I left off, and I'll pick up from there. I was supposed to get through book 8, but I didn't. But yeah, you'll unpack more about democracy, how democracy kind of devolves into something more like anarchy, and then leads to tyranny. They'll introduce tyranny at the end of book 8, and then all of book 9 is what tyranny is actually like. So thanks so much. Thank you, Sailor.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I will see you guys around. Let's see you in future classes.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure.